December 17, 1944, a crossroads outside a small Belgian town called Malmedy. Roughly 100 American soldiers, mostly artillery observers who had never fired a shot at anyone, are standing in a field with their hands up, having just surrendered to advancing German tanks. Within minutes, machine guns open up on them where they stand. By the time the guns stop, something has been broken in the American army that will not be repaired for the rest of the war, and it has nothing to do with tanks or artillery. It is trust in a piece of white cloth. We're going to tell you everything about what happened next today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start with the crossroads itself, and with the men who were standing on it. Part 1. On the morning of December 16, 1944, Germany launched what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, a massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, meant to split the American and British armies and reach the port of Antwerp before the Allies could recover. Hitler had committed nearly 250,000 men to the attack, timed deliberately for a stretch of low cloud and heavy fog that grounded Allied aircraft and hid the buildup from reconnaissance almost entirely. By the time it was over, 5 weeks later, the battle would cost the American army something close to 19,000 dead and over 60,000 wounded, with German losses running comparably high, making it the costliest single battle the United States Army fought in the entire war. None of that scale was visible yet on December 16th. What was visible was speed, German columns moving faster and deeper than anyone on the American side had accounted for. Spearheading one of the main thrusts was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, under the command of Joachim Peiper, a young, aggressive, and already notorious officer who had built his reputation on the Eastern Front, where his division had a documented history of killing civilians and prisoners well before it ever reached Belgium. Only a year earlier, in September 1943, after partisans near the Italian town of Baugnez killed one of his soldiers and captured 2 others, Peiper had negotiated the prisoners' release through local intermediaries, then burned the town anyway, killing 24 civilians and destroying hundreds of buildings, despite his own promise not to. It was investigated after the war, and stands as one more entry in a pattern that made his arrival in the Ardennes, for the men who ended up in front of him, considerably more dangerous than an ordinary armored spearhead. Peiper's battle group had been ordered to move fast and ignore its own flanks in the race toward the Meuse River. Speed was the entire point of Peiper's mission, and prisoners, on a schedule like that, are a problem. They need guards. They need trucks. They need time nobody in a battle group racing toward a river has any intention of spending. On December 17th, elements of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, an American unit whose job was measuring enemy artillery fire rather than fighting tank battles, ran directly into Kampfgruppe Peiper's spearhead near a crossroads called Baugnez, a couple of miles southeast of Malmedy itself. Outgunned and outmaneuvered, the Americans surrendered. They were disarmed, herded into a field beside the road, and left standing there under guard while the column continued past them. Then, without a clear order that survivors could ever agree on, someone opened fire, and other Germans in the column joined in. Machine guns raked the field. Men who fell wounded were finished off with pistol shots where they lay. Roughly 84 American soldiers died in that field, most of them still holding their hands in the air when the first bullets hit. A number of men survived by lying still among the dead, in the snow, in December cold, for as long as they could stand it, while German soldiers walked among the bodies afterward, finishing off anyone who moved or moaned. Some of those survivors eventually broke and ran for a nearby woods under fire, and a handful made it. 43 of them reached American lines, most within hours, found by a patrol from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion in Malmedy itself that same afternoon. What they described did not sound like the fog of war. It sounded like disarmed men being murdered where they stood, and by evening on December 17th, that description was already spreading through the American units holding the line across the whole Ardennes front. Part 2. What happened over the next several days is the part of this story that actually explains the title of this video. News of Malmedy did not travel as a rumor that grew in the retelling. It traveled as a fact, confirmed within hours by survivors who had literally walked out of the field where it happened. And it reached American soldiers who were, at that exact moment, deciding in real time whether to trust the next German unit that tried to surrender to them. The reaction was immediate, and it was not subtle. On December 21st, 4 days after Malmedy, headquarters of the 328th Infantry Regiment issued Fragmentary Order No. 27, a real, surviving document later cited in the U.S. Army's own official history of the Ardennes campaign. Its instruction was direct. No SS troops or paratroopers were to be taken prisoner, but were to be shot on sight. That is not a rumor passed along a foxhole line. That is a written order from an American regimental headquarters 4 days after Malmedy, telling soldiers to kill men who were trying to surrender, provided those men wore the wrong uniform. The Army's own post-war history would later try to describe this as an isolated instruction rather than a general policy, and in the narrowest technical sense, that is true. There was no single Army-wide directive rescinding the rules of war. But historians who have gone back through the records since have called that official denial, in the words of one, a little disingenuous, because the wider reality on the ground across the Ardennes front in the days after Malmedy was an unofficial understanding, passed soldier to soldier and unit to unit without ever needing to be written down twice, that SS troops in particular should not expect to survive the act of raising their hands. A white flag, in other words, stopped being a piece of cloth that ended a fight. In the days after Malmedy, in Patton's sector and elsewhere, it became a gesture that a growing number of American soldiers were no longer willing to trust, and in some documented cases, were under instructions not to honor at all. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Part 3. Not every white flag in the Ardennes that December was a lie, and the war produced, within days of Malmedy, one of its most famous demonstrations of the opposite. The 101st Airborne had been trucked into Bastogne in a hurry on December 19th, 3 days after the German offensive opened, and by December 20th, the town was completely encircled, its garrison cut off from resupply, short on ammunition and medical supplies, and holding a road junction the German advance badly needed. On December 22, 1944, with the division surrounded at Bastogne and the town's fate genuinely uncertain, a small German delegation approached the American lines under a flag of truce. 2 officers, Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps and Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of Panzer Lehr, accompanied by 2 enlisted men, were blindfolded according to the accepted rules of a parley and led in to deliver a written surrender ultimatum to the American command. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the besieged division, read the German demand that the Americans surrender the town within 2 hours or face annihilation by artillery, and reportedly responded with a single word out loud: nuts. His staff had to help him turn that into a formal reply the Germans could actually deliver back to their own command, and the note that was eventually handed back read simply, "To the German commander, nuts." The German officers, confused by the American slang, had to have the reply explained to them by their own escort before they understood it was a refusal. They were blindfolded again, walked back through the lines, and released unharmed, exactly as the rules of a flag of truce require. One of the actual blindfold cloths used that day was later, by one account, simply repurposed by a soldier to clean his rifle. A strange, small, human detail from a moment that has since become one of the most quoted exchanges of the entire war. Bastogne held. On December 26th, 4 days after the nuts reply and 10 days after Malmedy, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion, spearheading the relief column of the 4th Armored Division from George Patton's 3rd Army, broke through the German ring around the town. A tank named Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Baugnez, was the first vehicle to reach the American lines inside Bastogne, closing a siege that had lasted 6 days, and ending the immediate threat to the division that had, days earlier, refused a demand to surrender under exactly the kind of white flag that, elsewhere on the same front, had just been used to set a trap. Part 4. Patton's 3rd Army had turned north to make that relief possible in one of the most demanding maneuvers of the entire campaign, wheeling 90 degrees and driving more than 100 miles in under 3 days to reach Bastogne, a movement senior American commanders considered close to impossible on that timeline, and that Patton delivered anyway. The same low cloud and fog that had hidden the German buildup on December 16th was still grounding Allied aircraft as 3rd Army raced north, and Patton, a man who did not usually leave much to Providence, decided to ask for help anyway. On December 8th, before the offensive had even begun, he had already called his Third Army chaplain, Monsignor James H. O'Neill, and asked him, in Patton's own phrase, for a good prayer for weather. O'Neill typed one on a 3x5 card, asking God to restrain the immoderate rains and grant fair weather for battle. And Patton had 250,000 copies of it printed and handed out to every soldier in the Third Army on December 22nd, the same day McAuliffe's staff was handing the Germans their one-word answer at Bastogne. Within days, the skies cleared enough for Allied fighter bombers to get back into the fight over the relief column's route, a piece of timing good enough that men who received that card in their pocket that Christmas remembered it for the rest of their lives, whatever they made of the reason behind it. It placed Third Army directly into the same Ardennes battlefield where Malmedy's shadow was still spreading through every unit that heard about it. And it placed Patton's own soldiers inside the same climate of suspicion that Malmedy had created for the whole American line. That climate did not stay abstract for very long. On January 1st, 1945, at a village called Chenogne, not far from Bastogne, soldiers of the 11th Armored Division, one of Patton's own Third Army formations, were holding a group of German prisoners, men from the Führerbegleit Brigade and the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division who had already surrendered. Somewhere between 60 and 80 of them were shot dead, on the ground, disarmed, in what post-war historians have since described as a direct, almost arithmetic act of revenge for Malmedy, roughly one German prisoner killed for every American killed at Baugnez 2 weeks earlier, carried out on verbal instructions passed down the chain that no prisoners were to be taken that day. Part 5. George Patton knew about it almost immediately, and he wrote about it in his own diary, a document now archived at the Library of Congress and available to any historian who wants to check the exact wording. His entry, dated January 4th, 1945, 3 days after the killings at Chenogne, records that his own men had also murdered some 50-odd German prisoners, and states plainly that he hoped the whole thing could be concealed. Those are close to his own words, preserved in his own handwriting, written by the same general whose Third Army had just executed one of the most celebrated relief operations of the entire war days earlier. Eisenhower's headquarters did order an investigation into Chenogne. The 11th Armored Division's own leadership was, by multiple later accounts, uncooperative with that inquiry, offering the explanation that it was too late. The relevant units had already been reorganized or disbanded, and the trail had gone cold by the time anyone asked serious questions. No one was ever prosecuted for what happened at Chenogne. Decades later, when American war crimes prosecutor Ben Ferentz, a man who had spent his career building cases against far larger atrocities, was shown declassified files on the incident, his verdict was blunt. It smelled, he said, like a cover-up. Part 6. Malmedy did eventually get its day in a courtroom, though not a satisfying one. In the spring and summer of 1946, American military tribunals at Dachau tried Peiper and dozens of his men for the killings at Baugnez and elsewhere along their route. All 73 defendants were convicted. 43 of them, Peiper included, were sentenced to death by hanging. 22 more got life imprisonment, and the remaining 8 got prison terms of 10 to 20 years, a verdict sheet that on paper looked like real accountability for a field full of murdered prisoners. The verdicts came down on July 16, 1946. None of the 43 death sentences were ever carried out. Peiper's own sentence was under review for years, commuted to life imprisonment in 1951, reduced again to 35 years in 1954, and Peiper walked out of prison on parole in 1956, a decade after the killings, having served roughly 10 years for a crime that killed 84 men. Part of the reason the sentence unraveled was a real and documented controversy over how the confessions used at trial had been obtained. Allegations of mock trials, hooding, and physical abuse of German defendants by American investigators. Serious enough that a United States Senate subcommittee investigated the interrogations in 1949, with Senator Joseph McCarthy personally pushing the abuse claims hard enough that his own motives were questioned, given the number of German-American voters in his home state. The subcommittee ultimately found no evidence that confessions had been beaten out of anyone, though it did confirm a small number of the more theatrical interrogation tactics had genuinely been used. Whatever the truth of those specific claims, the practical result was years of appeals, commutations, and a much shorter prison sentence than 84 murdered men might have suggested was coming. Peiper did not get to live out his life quietly after his release. He settled eventually in the small French town of Treves, and on Bastille Day, July 14, 1976, his house was firebombed in the night. Firefighters found his remains inside, a body that had apparently tried to defend itself with a pistol and a rifle before being overcome by smoke. A group calling itself the Avengers claimed responsibility. No one was ever arrested, charged, or convicted for his killing, and to this day, the case remains formally unsolved. 3 decades of silence closing over the field at Baugnez in a way no courtroom ever quite managed to. The verdict. Why did Patton and the men under his command, and American soldiers across the whole Ardennes front, stop trusting the white flag in the winter of 1944? Not because of a single ambush that fooled them once. Because Malmedy proved, in the space of a single afternoon at a crossroads outside a small town, that surrendering did not guarantee survival. And once that lesson had traveled through the ranks by word of mouth and by written order alike, the flag itself stopped being a reliable signal for anyone holding a rifle on either side of it. Some men, like McAuliffe's staff at Bastogne, honored it anyway, exactly as the rules of war require. And that decision is remembered today as one of the proudest moments of the entire campaign. Other men, in Patton's own Third Army, at a village most people have never heard of, did not honor it at all, 2 weeks after Malmedy and 6 days after Bastogne, and that decision was buried rather than prosecuted, in a diary entry that survives specifically because the general who wrote it never expected the rest of us to read it. They remember 84 men in a snow-covered field outside Malmedy, most of them with their hands still raised when the shooting started. They remember 2 blindfolded German officers walking back to their own lines at Bastogne with a one-word answer they didn't understand yet. Honored, and released exactly as the rules said they should be. They remember 60 to 80 more men in a field at Chenogne 2 weeks later, disarmed the same way the men at Baugnez had been disarmed, and a general's private diary entry hoping the world would never find out. Both a betrayal and its honored opposite happened on the same battlefield, in the same 6 weeks, under the same white cloth. For years afterward, a roadside monument stood at the Baugnez crossroads itself, and for a while a small museum stood beside it, cataloging the vehicles, uniforms, and photographs of that whole winter for anyone who wanted to stand on the actual field and understand what the ground underneath them had seen. The museum has since closed, but the crossroads is still there, still called Baugnez, still the place where 84 men found out that raising your hands was not, in December of 1944, a guarantee of anything at all. Now you know what was in the file. Did your father or grandfather serve with the Third Army, the 101st Airborne, or anywhere in the Ardennes that winter? Tell us his name and unit in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.